They're using the Fibonacci sequence I identified. This way, everyone!
All right.
The most feared man in the city just met the only people he can't control, and they're only 4 feet tall. 6 years ago, Amara Kincaid disappeared from this estate as a lowly maid, but she just walked back into the Knox Lion's den with a secret that will bring the Mafia's cold king to his knees. Salvatore Knox thought he was the end of his bloodline, until he looked into the eyes of 2 genius twins who possess his own ruthless intellect. But Amara isn't here for a reunion. She's here to quit for good, and she's brought a legacy buyout contract that could dismantle his entire empire. Watch until the very end to see the moment this heartless boss finally cracks. And don't forget to like and subscribe as we reveal how 2 children with a rolling suitcase managed to outsmart a room full of hitmen. The power dynamic is about to shift, and the ghost of the kitchen is about to prove that a mother's love is more dangerous than a mafia war. The silence in the great hall was heavy enough to crush a lesser man, but Amara Kincaid stood in the center of it with the stillness of a storm's eye. Salvatore Knox remained frozen on one knee, his eyes darting between the woman he had once treated as a fixture of the house and the 2 children who carried his DNA like a silent accusation. His bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, their hands hovering near their holsters, but a sharp, single-fingered gesture from Salvatore kept them back. This wasn't a breach to be handled with lead. It was a reckoning. Amara, Salvatore rasped, his voice sounding foreign even to himself. 6 years. I thought you were dead? Gone. Inconsequential. Amara interrupted, her voice a cool blade that sliced through his sentiment. I was exactly where I needed to be to ensure they never became like you. She didn't look at the opulence around her with awe. She looked at it with a weary disgust that made Salvatore's chest tighten. Zuri, the twin girl, stepped forward, her small hand resting on the handle of the black suitcase. She adjusted her glasses, her gaze scanning the room with a clinical precision that mirrored Salvatore's own tactical mind. Mother, Zuri whispered, her voice crisp and eerily mature. The atmospheric tension is exceeding productive levels. Shall we proceed with the filing? Amara nodded once and reached into a hidden pocket of her uniform, pulling out a legal-grade envelope. She didn't hand it to him. She dropped it on the marble floor between them. I'm not here for an apology, Salvatore. I'm here for a buyout. Salvatore stood slowly, his joints stiff, and retrieved the document. His eyes blurred as he read the heading. Legacy indemnification and final severance. A legacy tax? He asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a reflex of the businessman he was. You want money to leave? I want the resources to ensure they are never found by your enemies, Amara stated, her posture firm and protective. Consider it the price of your peace of mind. You sign this, you transfer the funds to a blind trust, and we vanish. You get to keep your empire of shadows, and I get to keep my children's future. No more Black Maid, returning to haunt your conscience. We become ghosts again. Salvatore looked at the twins. Cairo was holding a book, his thumb marking a page on advanced game theory, looking at his father not with love, but with curiosity, as if Salvatore were a complex puzzle he had already solved. The realization hit Salvatore like a freight train. For 6 years, he had been fighting for power, but he had already lost the only thing that mattered. You think I can just let you walk out after seeing them? Salvatore's voice dropped to a dangerous, pleading low. This isn't just a contract, Amara. This is my blood. It's blood you spilled a long time ago, Amara countered, her eyes calm but resolute. Sign the paper, Salvatore. Let us go before the monsters you created realize that the cold king actually has a heart to be pierced. Salvatore looked at the pen in his hand, then at the children who represented a redemption he didn't think he deserved. The legacy tax was a ticket to a life where he was truly alone. Salvatore stared at the contract in his hand, the weight of the paper feeling heavier than the millions it demanded. Before he could speak, the silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Cairo Vale had stepped away from his mother's side, his small leather shoes clicking against the marble as he approached the high-tech security console embedded in the wall. The boy tilted his head, his glasses catching the light of the grand chandelier, and he didn't look like a child. He looked like an apex predator evaluating a rival's territory. The thermal encryption on your primary gate is 3 years out of date, Mr. Knox, Cairo remarked, his voice devoid of intimidation, but heavy with a chilling, clinical observation. He reached out a small finger, tracing the edge of the sleek interface. You focus 88% of your defensive budget on physical deterrence, men with guns and reinforced steel, but your digital perimeter has a vulnerability large enough to drive a freight train through. Or an assassin's virus. Salvatore's lead bodyguard, a man known only as Marco, took a step forward, his face reddening with a mix of confusion and offense. Listen, kid. Actually, he's correct, Zuri chimed in, her voice crisp and eerily calm as she adjusted her own frames. She didn't move from Amara's side, but her eyes were fixed on the shadows in the upper balcony. Your rotation of the third-floor sentries follows a predictable Fibonacci sequence. It's elegant, perhaps, but once a pattern is identified, it provides a 42-second window of total invisibility every 20 minutes. If I were seeking to dismantle this organization from the shadows, that is where I would begin my cleaning house at. Salvatore felt a cold sweat prickle at his hairline. These weren't just insults, they were tactical freight trains of realization that mirrored his own paranoia. He looked at Amara, who remained composed, her expression a mask of quiet authority. She wasn't just a maid who had returned. She had brought 2 architects of logic into a world built on brute force. You've spent years building a kingdom of fear, Salvatore, Amara said, her voice a low, melodic warning. But you've forgotten how to listen to the details that the powerful deem beneath them. You're relying on your coldness to keep you safe, but these children can see right through your armor. Cairo turned back from the console, his expression neutral. The traitor you're looking for isn't at the gate, father. They are already in your inner circle, likely hiding behind the very security protocols you think are protecting you. The room seemed to shrink. Salvatore realized that the $3 million he had been prepared to lose in a deal earlier that day was nothing compared to the intellectual wealth standing in his foyer. The twins weren't just his blood. They were a mirror of his own methodical and patient nature, refined into something far more dangerous than he had ever been. Give me 48 hours, Salvatore said, his voice thick with a new kind of desperation. If you can find the leak in my empire that my best men have missed, I won't just sign the buyout, I'll double it. But you stay here, under my protection, until the audit is complete. Amara looked at her children, then back at the man who was finally beginning to crack his emotional armor. She knew the hunt had begun. The transition from the cold marble foyer to the private living quarters was intended to be a display of overwhelming wealth. A tactical move by Salvatore to remind Amara and the twins of the kingdom he offered. He gestured toward a sprawling suite filled with rare silks, custom-made toys, and high-end tech that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. It was the Cold King's attempt to bridge the gap using the only language he had mastered, power and possessions. He watched them closely, expecting the wide-eyed wonder that usually accompanied such luxury clashing with emotional tension, but the twins didn't even blink. Cairo walked past a gold-plated tablet without a second glance, while Zuri stood before a wall of designer clothes as if she were inspecting a lineup of suspects. The atmosphere remained tense, cinematic, and gritty, the opulence doing little to soften the emotional armor Amara had built around her children. Salvatore felt a familiar pang of frustration. His reliance on fear and money was failing him for the first time. I had the kitchen prepare a 5-course menu, Salvatore said, his voice echoing in the vast room. Anything you want, anything you've ever lacked is yours. This is a Knox inheritance. Amara turned to him, her elegant and composed demeanor unwavering. She didn't look at the silk or the gold. You're trying to buy their loyalty with things, Salvatore. But they've spent 6 years learning that things are easily taken away by men like you. She stepped closer, the quiet authority in her eyes making him feel smaller than the children at her side. They don't want your ink on a check or your blood on the floor. They want the one thing you've never given anyone, time and the truth. Zuri looked up from a crystal vase she had been studying. The probability of us staying increases by 64% if you provide a factual account of the night Mother left, she stated, her voice a freight train, of logic that hit Salvatore squarely in his chest. We require the truth about the ghosts in your past, not the silk on our beds. Salvatore looked at the twins, the curious, observant, and emotionally guarded geniuses who were his living legacy. He realized that the blood and ink of his business world meant nothing to them. They were demanding a redemption he wasn't sure he could provide. He saw himself in their analytical stares and realized that to keep them, he would have to dismantle the cold nature he had spent 42 years perfecting. "You want the truth?" Salvatore asked, his voice rough with a raw and pleading honesty he hadn't felt in decades. He sat down, not in his throne-like desk chair, but on a simple ottoman, bringing himself level with his children. "Then we start with why I let your mother go, and why I've been looking for her every day since." The high-stakes life or death situation of his mafia war faded into the background as he began to speak, realizing that listening to those he once deemed powerless was the only way to save himself. The air in the private wing grew heavy as the tense, cinematic, and gritty atmosphere of the present collided with the shadows of the past. Salvatore's gaze drifted toward the darkened kitchen corridor, a place that once served as the heart of his home but had since become a tomb of memories. He began to speak, his voice dropping into a low, raw and pleading tone that signaled a shift in his cold nature toward a possible path of redemption. 6 years ago, the Knox estate had been a kingdom built on extreme paranoia and security, a fortress where Salvatore reigned with a reliance on fear and power. Amara had been the silent observer, the woman who moved through the halls like a shadow, seeing the man behind the emotional armor. The breaking point hadn't been a single event, but a high-stakes life or death situation that had forced her hand. Salvatore had been deep in a war with a rival faction, a conflict that turned his home into a battlefield where he had forgotten how to listen to those he deemed powerless. The night she left, the kitchen had been filled with the scent of a meal Salvatore would never eat. Amar had discovered a massive conspiracy brewing within his inner circle, a betrayal that mirrored the ghost of a dead man returning to haunt the living. She had seen the poisoner at work, not just in the food, but in the very air of the house. She realized that if she stayed, her unborn children would be raised in a circle of traitors, destined to become either casualties or monsters themselves. "I saw you looking at the tactical maps more than you looked at me," Amara whispered, her quiet authority grounding the flashback in the present reality. "I realized that in your world, love was just another vulnerability to be liquidated." Salvatore bowed his head, the regret and fear of loss visible in the way his hands clasped together. He had been so focused on protecting his empire and legacy that he had become the very threat she needed to escape. He hadn't just lost a maid that night. He had lost the hope for redemption that she and the twins now represented. The flashback revealed the true why. Amara hadn't left out of fear for herself, but out of a selfless bravery to protect the genius potential of Cairo and Zuri from a father who only knew how to survive through methodical and patient violence. The twins watched him, their curious and observant eyes absorbing the truth of their origin. A story of a man who was once cold and untouchable, and the woman who chose the wisdom of the streets over a palace of blood. The morning light filtered through the reinforced glass of the Knox estate, but the warmth did not reach the tension simmering in the breakfast room. Salvatore sat across from Cairo and Zuri, watching as they meticulously analyzed the data on their tablets rather than the gourmet spread before them. The redemption he sought felt fragile, a thin veil over a cold nature that was being tested by the ticking clock of his 48-hour reprieve. The peace was shattered by the shrill, synchronized vibration of every mobile device in the room. Salvatore's lead security officer, Marco, burst through the doors, his face a mask of urgent tactical alarm. On the monitors, a grainy video feed from the elite academy where the twins had been scheduled for a placement interview began to play. A black SUV had idled at the gates just long enough to lob a heavy, gift-wrapped box onto the lawn before speeding away. "The Moretti family," Salvatore hissed, his hands tightening into fists as his emotional armor cracked with a new kind of terror. Not for his empire, but for his blood. This was a warning, a message from a rival faction that had watched the Black Maid return and correctly identified her children as the Knox Achilles heel. The box wasn't a bomb. When it was remotely detonated by the bomb squad, it showered the school's crest in blood-red paint and a swarm of black envelopes, each one addressed to Cairo and Zuri Vale. Zuri didn't flinch. She watched the explosion on the screen with curious and observant detachment, her mind already calculating the trajectory of the threat. The Morettas are utilizing a psychological siege tactic, she noted, her voice a freight train of chilling logic. By targeting the institution of learning rather than the fortress, they are signaling that our intellectual development is a variable they intend to terminate. It is a classic move of an enemy who feels methodical and patient, but lacks the courage for a direct confrontation. Cairo looked up from his book, his eyes cold and guarded beyond his age. Their security at the perimeter was bypassed via a standard social engineering exploit at the delivery entrance. If you want to protect us, Father, you cannot simply hide us behind men with guns. You have to eliminate the source of the poison before it reaches the roots. Amara stepped between her children and the screens, her firm and protective posture radiating a quiet authority that even the frantic guards respected. She looked at Salvatore, not with the desire to flee, but with the selfless bravery of a woman who knew the cleaning house had officially begun. They know who they are, Salvatore, Amara said, her voice a low, melodic warning. The ghosts of your past aren't just haunting you anymore. They're hunting our children. This is the high-stakes life or death situation I tried to run from. Salvatore stood, his raw and pleading expression hardening into the face of the man who had survived through extreme paranoia. The test run was over. The hunt had begun. The aftermath of the Moretti warning left the grand foyer thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy footsteps of tactical teams sweeping the perimeter. Salvatore stood amidst the chaos, but his world had narrowed down to the three people standing in the center of the hall. The reality of the near miss, the fact that his children had been seconds away from a choreographed slaughter, cracked the last of his emotional armor. He was no longer the cold king of the underground. He was a man staring at the wreckage of a life he had built on the wrong foundations. Amara was already reaching for the handle of the small suitcase, her face a mask of firm and protective resolve. Her quiet authority was now sharpened by a mother's terror. This is exactly why I left, Salvatore, she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. I won't wait for the next warning to be a funeral. We are leaving. Now. As she turned to usher Cairo and Zuri toward the exit, Salvatore did something that silenced the entire room. He didn't bark an order. He didn't signal his guards to block the door. Instead, the most feared man in the city dropped to his knees on the cold marble, his hands clasped in a gesture of regret, fear of loss, and powerless love. It was the iconic moment of his transformation, a public surrender that stripped him of his pride in front of the very men who feared him. Amara, wait, he pleaded, his expression raw and pleading as he looked up at her. I am a man of extreme paranoia, but I am also a man who has just seen the only truth worth living for. If you walk out that door, you aren't just taking my heirs, you're taking the only hope for redemption I have left. Cairo and Zuri watched him with curious and observant eyes, their glasses reflecting the sight of a titan brought low. They saw the freight train of realization hitting their father, the understanding that his empire was a tomb without them. I have spent 42 years building walls, Salvatore continued, his voice breaking. But I will tear them all down. I will dismantle every poisoned part of this life to make a world safe for them. Please, don't leave me in the dark again. I am listening now, Amara. I am finally listening. Amara paused, her hand tightening on the suitcase. She looked down at the man who had once been cold and untouchable, now kneeling like a beggar for a chance at a family. The high-stakes life or death situation hadn't just revealed his enemies. It had revealed a father who was finally willing to crack his emotional armor to save what mattered. The silence that followed was a climax of tension, a heartbeat where the future of the Knox legacy hung in the balance. Amara looked at the twins who remained emotionally guarded, then back at Salvatore's desperate face. She didn't let go of the suitcase, but she didn't move toward the door. The heavy silence of the great hall was slowly replaced by the rhythmic clicking of Zuri's keyboard as she sat cross-legged on a velvet ottoman, her small frame a stark contrast to the grim-faced men surrounding her. Salvatore stood behind her, his breath held, watching the data streams on her screen move with a velocity his own analysts couldn't match. The climax of tension shifted from a physical threat to a digital one. as Zuri began to unravel the massive conspiracy that had nearly cost them their lives. "You're looking for a person, father, but you should be looking for a pattern," Zuri said, her voice a freight train of chilling precision. She didn't look up from the screen. Her fingers danced over the keys with a methodical and patient grace. "Your payroll reflects a standard deviation that shouldn't exist. There is a recurring microtransaction of 0.04% hidden within the logistics budget for Pier 17. To your human auditors, it looks like a rounding error. To a mathematical model, it's a beacon." Salvatore leaned in, his emotional armor fully discarded. He felt a surge of pride that transcended business. He was witnessing a genius audit of his entire life's work. "Who does it lead to, Zuri?" "It's not a who yet, it's a where," she countered, her glasses reflecting a map of the city's digital infrastructure. "The funds are being redirected to a ghost server that shouldn't have power. The poisoner in your ranks isn't just taking money. They are feeding the Moretti family your real-time location data. Every time you move, a packet of data is sent. It's an automatic betrayal script." Marco, the lead guard, shifted his weight, his hand tightening on his weapon. Zuri's eyes flicked to him on the screen's reflection before returning to the code. The script was initiated from a terminal inside this house, 36 minutes before the Moretti warning at the school. It required a physical biometric override, someone with level red clearance. Salvatore's gaze swept the room, his extreme paranoia now sharpened by his daughter's logic. The circle of traitors was shrinking. He saw the subtle beads of sweat on the brow of his longest-serving lieutenant, Vincent, whose rigid posture had suddenly become too stiff. "The calculations are absolute, Salvatore," Amara added, her quiet authority anchoring the moment. "She isn't guessing. She's showing you the ghost in your machine." Zuri hit a final key, and a single name flashed in bright red across the screen, linked to the biometric signature of the morning's breach. Salvatore didn't yell. He didn't even draw his gun. He simply looked at the man he had trusted for a decade, his voice dropping to a cold nature that was now tempered by a father's protective instinct. "Zuri just did in 10 minutes what you couldn't do in 10 years, Vincent. She found the leak. Now, I suggest you tell me how many more ghosts are waiting for us at the docks before I let her find where you've hidden your offshore accounts, too." The hope for redemption was no longer a vague concept. It was a weapon, and Salvatore realized that his genius twins weren't just his legacy. They were his greatest defense. The sirens of the Knox estate didn't wail. They hummed a low, vibrating frequency that rattled the crystal glassware in the dining hall. On the security monitors, the suboptimal digital perimeter Cairo had identified earlier was being shredded. The Moretti family wasn't sending a warning anymore. They were sending an army. Armed men in tactical gear swarmed the outer gardens, moving with a methodical and patient speed that suggested they knew exactly where the sentry blind spots were. "They're using the Fibonacci sequence I identified," Zuri shouted over the rising din of gunfire outside, her fingers flying across her tablet. "They've timed their breach to the 42-second invisibility window. Father, if you send the guards to the West Wing now, you're walking them into a crossfire." Salvatore stood at the center of the room, his emotional armor replaced by a cold, tactical clarity. He looked at Cairo. "What's the counterplay?" Cairo didn't hesitate. "Flood the secondary servers with the automatic betrayal script we found on Vincent's terminal. If we mirror their own data back at them, their HUDs will show their teammates as hostile targets. We turn their psychological siege against them." As Salvatore barked the orders to his remaining loyalists, the sound of a window shattering echoed from the floor above. The siege had reached the inner sanctum. Salvatore drew his weapon, but Amara stepped forward, her firm and protective posture radiating a quiet authority that stopped him in his tracks. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding the legacy indemnification envelope. "The panic room is compromised, Salvatore," she said, her voice a low, melodic anchor in the storm. "We don't hide. We move. Cairo, drop the internal shutters on the east corridor. Zuri, kill the lights and switch the estate to thermal. If they want to hunt in the dark, let them see what happens when they hunt a Knox." The climax of tension hit a fever pitch as the lights died, plunging the grand mansion into a predatory gloom. For the first time, the Cold King wasn't leading alone. He moved in a tight diamond formation with Amara and the twins, a family working together in a way that defied the violent world outside. Cairo's voice whispered through Salvatore's earpiece, directing him toward the heat signatures of the intruders with mathematical precision. Zuri manipulated the smart home's acoustics, creating ghost footsteps that led the Moretti hitmen into dead ends where Salvatore's loyalists waited. It was a high-stakes life-or-death situation that had transformed into a masterclass of unified intellect. Salvatore realized that his children weren't just genius twins to be protected. They were the most dangerous weapons in his arsenal. When the final breach occurred in the Great Hall, Salvatore didn't just fire. He waited for Zuri's signal. Now, she whispered. A massive surge of fire-suppressant gas flooded the room, blinding the attackers. In the whiteout, Salvatore moved like a wraith, neutralizing the threat with a methodical efficiency that was no longer fueled by hate, but by a desperate, selfless bravery to keep his family whole. When the mist cleared, the Moretti captain lay disarmed at Salvatore's feet. Salvatore didn't pull the trigger. He looked at Amara, then at the children who had just saved his life. He saw the hope for redemption in their calm faces. He lowered his weapon, signaling that the cleaning house was finally over. The siege had failed, and in its ruins, a new kind of empire had been born. The smoke from the siege had barely cleared before Salvatore Knox began the most difficult liquidation of his career. It wasn't a rival family he was dismantling this time, but the very empire of shadows that had defined him. True to his word, the Cold King of the Underground spent the following weeks in a methodical and patient deconstruction of his criminal assets, converting bloodstained capital into the foundation of something the twins could actually inherit without looking over their shoulders. The grand mahogany table that once held tactical maps and hit orders was now covered in blueprints for Knoxville Systems, a legitimate cybersecurity and venture tech firm. Salvatore sat at the head, but the power dynamic had shifted completely. He was no longer the sole dictator. He was a student of his own children's genius potential. Cairo and Zuri sat on either side of him, their glasses reflecting lines of clean code rather than security feeds. They were no longer the emotionally guarded children who had arrived with a single suitcase. They were the architects of a new kind of power. Amara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her quiet authority, now softened by a peace she hadn't known in 6 years. She had traded her maid's uniform for the composed elegance of a chief executive, overseeing the transition of their lives from a high-stakes life-or-death situation to a future of redemption. She watched as Salvatore leaned over to listen to Cairo explain a new encryption protocol, seeing the regret and fear of loss in his eyes replaced by a quiet, protective pride. The probability of a hostile takeover from the Moretti remnants has dropped to 0.03%, Zuri noted, closing her laptop with a decisive click. The market responds better to innovation than intimidation, father. It's a more sustainable variable. Salvatore looked at his daughter and smiled, a genuine, rare expression that finally cracked the last of his emotional armor. He realized that the cleaning house wasn't just about removing traitors. It was about removing the man he used to be. He had traded his throne of fear for a seat at a family table. As the sun set over the city, the Knox estate no longer felt like a fortress or a tomb. It felt like a home. The Black Maid had returned not to serve a master, but to reclaim a father for her children. And in doing so, she had built an empire that no bullet could touch. Salvatore reached across the table, placing his hand over Amara's and his children's. The Cold King was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood that his greatest legacy wasn't the territory he conquered, but the family he had finally earned the right to keep.